This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 417, the Recipes Initiative. On today's show, we're talking about the Recipes Initiative, the future of install profiles, if distros are still a thing, and answering a bunch of listener questions with our guest, Jim Birch. We'll also cover the Quick Links kit as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Jim Birch. Jim is an internet professional who can bridge the gap between technical staff and business goals with specialties in Drupal, front-end development, content strategy, and SEO. He is an accomplished strategist, developer, community organizer, and believer in bridging open source communities. He spends his days leading an incredibly talented team of Drupal engineers at Canopy Studios. Jim, welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are, for the next few weeks, Jen Lambton, owner at Generation Web Development. Welcome back.
Morning.
By the way, I love the kind of, I don't know what you call it, alliteration or the name of your company containing your name, because my company name kind of does the same thing with my initials.
Nice.
But I always love to see that with other people too. Also joining us, as usual, John Picozzi, solution architect at EPAM. How are you doing?
Hello, everyone. I'm actually surprised, Nick, that you being the lingophile that you are. You don't know like what that is called. I feel like there should be some sort of linguistic name for
It's probably something to do with eponymous, because eponymous means like self-named or something.
There you go.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever needed to add a set of quick links, essentially visual navigation prompts, to the home page or section pages of your Drupal site? There's a module for that. It's called the Quick Links Kit, which is different from the Quick Link module created by last week's guest, Mike Herschel. It's a module that I created in April of 2021. It has a 1.06 version that supports Drupal 8, 9, and 10, and a 2.0.1 version that supports only Drupal 10 for reasons we'll talk about a little bit later. It is, to be honest, sporadically maintained, but a pretty simple module. And really, once it's installed and you've imported the configuration, it's something that you can safely uninstall and not really need anymore anyway. Now, it has only one issue open, which is not a bug, which is probably not surprising considering that it is, according to Drupal.org, in use by only one website currently. Now, the module is really just a set of configuration with an optional submodule that sets everything up, including the placement of the block on the homepage for sites using Olivero as their theme. So it's perfect for a fresh install of Drupal. It allows for SVG icons to be set for each link and sets their fill to inherit from the link style. The links can be created and managed without leaving the page on which they're used. By using the settings tray, there would be a quick configuration change to use a modal or a separate page instead, if that's your preference. The 2.0 version also makes use of Drupal 10's new responsive grid views display. So if that's something you've been wanting to try out, this is an easy way to take it for a spin. I thought this module was appropriate for today's episode because it's an example of a module that will be a great candidate to be a recipe once the infrastructure for them is ready. Now, that said, the Olivero submodule does currently contain a little bit of CSS to improve the display of links, but that could easily be copied into your site's custom theme. So let's talk about the Quick Links Kit.
I'd like to update the usage stats. It looks like 2 sites report using this module.
You've doubled, it's exponential growth. You've doubled your user base.
And so it begins.
Directly related to Talking Drupal, I'm sure. So, Martin, I'm wondering, what was your use case for creating the module? Was it just a necessity for you to be able to quickly add links in this manner, or was there some other use case that you had for it?
So it actually started because I was working on a project that was really creating a website template that was going to be in use for multiple sort of small municipal sites. And so that was sort of a common requirement across all of them, because they'll usually have, like, where do I get my parking permits, or, different kinds of things, as sort of, having those quick links on the homepage was sort of a common pattern for municipal sites. And I had built it as a module specifically because, I wanted to be reusable across those different sites. And then at the end of the day, it seemed like something that could easily be, made into a contrib module and really shared with, the rest of the community.
Got it. That's super interesting, and I like the use of the settings drawer aspect of it. That feels like a really great way to administer that.
Yeah, I think on that project I had used that quite a bit. So also using the settings tray with a custom block for, or with the config page module, to be able to have things like the header as something you could sort of like slide out and change without, again, leaving the page, which I think for editors is kind of a nice pattern to say, I don't have to take you off to someplace else. You can stay where you are, make updates without sort of leaving the page that you're on.
One question I had is the icons. How customizable are those?
So it's really just using, essentially what it will create is a custom media type for SVG image, and then you can import whatever SVG icons you want. So it can be from like IcoMoon or any of the popular libraries that are out there.
Oh, nice.
Based on the visual on the module page, it looks like you can just upload your own too, right? Just to drop an SVG in there if you want.
Exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
Are the images required?
I don't believe that they are, but that's a good question. If they are required, it would be a simple update. Once you have it installed, to either make them not required or to remove the field entirely, because it is, at the end of the day, it's just a set of sort of starting point configuration that you can then customize to your particular needs.
So based on our primary topic today, I assume that you, based on what you said, are considering moving this to a recipe maybe at some future state?
Yeah, I think, once it feels like, recipes are no longer experimental and ready to go, I have this as well as a number of other modules that I'm looking forward to making into recipes.
Interesting. Well, maybe throughout the show we'll figure out how you could make that transition and what that transition might look like for the end user.
I'm looking forward to hearing more about that.
Well, as always, Martin, thank you for your on-topic module of the week, and I'm interested in seeing how that's going to work too. So, thank you. See you next week. Okay, so moving on to our primary topic, let's start off with what I would think is a simple question, but might have some unexpected complexity. Can you tell us what recipes are?
Sure. So the Drupal Distribution and Recipes Initiative, the code in the project creates or allows for the installation of Drupal recipes, which allows for the automation of Drupal modules to be installed and configured using Drupal core as like the installation runner. It is meant as an effort to add on to the ambitious site builder effort that Dries introduced a couple of years ago, where we would want to allow a site builder to install suites of functionality. So that's traditionally been done using installation profiles in Drupal and distributions. Occasionally features in Drupal 7, and there are a few different solutions using a lot of configuration manipulation modules in modern Drupal or Drupal 8 plus, whatever we're calling it these days. But the difference is that once you start with an install profile from Drupal or a distribution, you're stuck with it for life. So you can never get rid of the installation profile. With a distribution, the dependencies are so interwoven that, if you try to uninstall something, you may uninstall something else accidentally. The idea of recipes is that they hold no code. They are for installing configuration and requiring other dependencies. And they're meant to be composable and ephemeral. So you can connect them. You could have multiple recipes being called from recipes. But once you install them, they're gone. There's no witness of it. So in a module like quick links that we just learned about, that is basically a configuration only module. He has no code in his install, his module file. You can install that module, but traditionally when you uninstall a module, you would uninstall that configuration. So in a quick link kit recipe, you could install that configuration and nobody would be the wiser. You'd have it forever. You could have it and alter it as you see fit. So this tool, is meant to not necessarily replace the installation profiles or replace distributions, but become a tool in that stack. So there are some distributions where they want you to stick with the distribution altogether. There's Open Social does so much, to create a social media website for yourself. Like you kind of need them to continue to update the code. But if I just want to blog, or if I want to add on a recipe book like Umami, those are good examples for just like adding suites of functionality. We've seen the most interest right now from agencies like myself, who want to have a starter recipe that it lets us install everything we need to, but not tie our clients to it forever. So there's a couple use cases, but then we're spinning around use cases like, how do you do mail service on a host that doesn't rely on mail service? So could we have a simple recipe that installs the SendGrid module and configures that for you? We've probably all done it a dozen times in our careers the last couple of years. Could be automated down to recipe, install this recipe.
So this is kind of bringing in the piece that we lost with features. It sounds like on some level, like there's some additional. I'm trying to find a way to say feature without using the word feature again. There's some additional features to recipes than the features module had, but I think on its face, people thought config management was kind of like features, but there's just a lot of there's a lot of gaps, right? You have to be really careful about what the site UID is. You have to be careful, like dependencies don't all automatically get exported. So our recipe is going to kind of be like that feature, like you turn it on, you get all this stuff and you're good to go. Or
yeah, I mean, it's once you install it, you have that functionality and you need to save it in your database or export it to your config management. But yeah, you could remove it from your composer.json or not even have it in your composer.json. Just bring the recipe down locally and install it and then push your changes. So because features were modules in themselves, it kind of moved on to, that you could use features to package up a module, but it's still a module and you still have the inherent problem of having to have it installed.
Yep.
For all those listeners, Nick, or for people that are just listening in, Nick really loves the features module. It's a constant that and web components are a constant topic, or at least used to be.
I
haven't used features probably in almost 10 years because kind of
it's true.
Hasn't been used since Drupal 8, but wow, it's been almost 10 years. But
it does exist.
It would be nice.
Yeah.
It does still exist.
So Jim, you kind of actually just touched on my question a little bit with what you were just saying. Before I ask my question, though, I would like to highlight the fact that you did a talk at Design for Drupal on this. We have the slides in the show notes for the listeners, and I was in that talk, and it was very, very cool and very interesting. So, thanks for coming on and joining us to talk
Sure.
more about it. So, moving on to my question, you just highlighted a little bit, that basically recipe is still something you need to install, right? So it works the same way as a module where you install it. It's just like after it installs and sets up all of the stuff that it needs to set up, you have the ability to uninstall it and remove it from your code base. Is that accurate?
It is not like a module. Maybe installation is the incorrect word. Maybe we should use the word applied.
Jim, in answering Nick's question, you kind of highlighted a little bit of what I was wondering about. And it really boils down to like how somebody would use a recipe, right? So like as a Drupal developer, right, I may want to, or an ambitious site builder, right, I may want to use a recipe on my Drupal site. Understanding that things are experimental right now, but like, how does somebody do that? Is it simply a composer require and they install it, apply it, kind of like a module that then they can just remove when they have the configuration, or is there some other process to that?
Sure, great question. So recipes are applied; they are not installed like a module or theme. You could require a recipe into your composer project, or you could require a recipe into your project using composer, as long as you added additional composer type, and the recipe's composer file specified it was a Drupal recipe. But inside of Drupal core, in core scripts, there is a script called Drupal, and the patch that you apply to get to use recipes has a command called a recipe, and you give it the path to the recipe, and that basically recipe runner grabs your recipe and applies it to Drupal. And then, if you wanted to keep it in your composer package, your composer file, you could, but you wouldn't need to. One thing that is on the roadmap is that a recipe could have a composer file and could require modules. But the recipe runner itself, Drupal, doesn't know about composer, right? Only composer knows about Drupal. So there's a gentleman who developed an add-on package called Drupal Recipes Unpack, which allows the recipe to unpack its dependencies from the recipes composer file to the main site's composer file. So you do have those things required moving forward.
So,
all right. So hold on. I got a follow-up here. Follow-up question. This feels like functionality that needs to be added to Drush, like, Drush get recipe or apply recipe, whatever the name is. Is that on the roadmap somewhere, or something somebody's thought of, or am I breaking new ground here?
It has been a feature request by people that have not built it yet, so it stays a feature request. Since this is going into Drupal core, the idea that the core scripts Drupal script would have everything it would need, and Drush wouldn't be a dependency.
But it also could be
be
pretty easy to add to Drush if it already has support in core, because Drush would just need to call the core command. So I feel like just because it's a feature request doesn't mean it's not likely to happen very quickly.
maybe I missed it, and then I will let you ask your question, Nick. I apologize, but maybe I missed it. But like, so if your recipe requires a module or a set of modules, right? That's only is that core command also running the composer to go get those modules?
No, I believe the composer require would be needed in that step.
Got it. Okay. Got it. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. In its the initiative is still in its infancy. One of the biggest issues we're working on now is creating the Drupal standard install profile as recipes. So, as far as core would be concerned, that standard install profile doesn't have any outside composer package needed. It would just be enabling modules. But yeah, as recipes evolve into the contrib space, that's when composer would be needed.
Good deal. Nick, sorry. Go ahead.
My question was kind of related, but it's really just around, it sounds like there's kind of two different types of recipes. One is that has other dependencies, and one is that really is truly ephemeral. And I'm just thinking about the delivery method of the more ephemeral ones, because I'm thinking as a developer, I'm not going to want to have to require something in Composer to apply the recipe and then remove it from Composer. Like that Composer step just seems extraneous, right? Now, for something that's a little bit more on the profile or distro side, where I want to reapply changes as they come down, that makes more sense to just include into Composer because it's a dependency of my project now. So I'm just thinking about like how can these recipes be delivered in a more ephemeral way when they truly are just ephemeral, like the quick links one that Martin mentioned, right?
I think that's through the core script though, right?
Well, the core script applies the recipe.
Applies it, doesn't fetch it.
Yeah. So in the quick links kit example, the recipe would have a config folder. So it'd be almost laid out like the module is now, except it would be applied, not installed. So that configuration would get imported into your Drupal instance. It only requires core modules. So like the sidebar deal and the media entity. So that in that instance, it would be, you wouldn't require anything in Composer. But yes, if you did require other modules, you would need that Composer step to go out and get the modules. And then this other Composer package, Drupal recipes unpack it to your main site.
So it sounds like to me either the core script has to be updated to go get the package and then apply it, right? Or maybe this is an area where Drush can kind of combine those two steps, even going as far, Nick, as to maybe uninstall it after the fact with a flag of some sort. So that way it kind of does the whole thing for you, right?
I mean, Drush doesn't do any Composer stuff really that I'm aware of, so I don't think it would do that step. I think it just, like Jim said, right? This is meant to be core, so you don't want additional dependencies.
So it's, right now, all the work that's being done is to get it into core. So, once that happens, it can be extended. There is a roadmap where, these things need to happen for phase 1 to get it into core, and then what happens in phase 2. Initiatives, to me, the Drupal core initiatives are the proof of concepts by extremely smart developers. And I just, should point out that is not me. So I'm an initiative coordinator at best. The initiative lead, Alex Pott, has worked a lot with Fabian Bircher and a lot of the people that have developed the configuration management system and the contrib modules that are in that config management space. So config ignore and config split, config actions. Wim Leers is doing a lot right now in the config validation space. So, the configuration management is great, but it is actually like when you import it into Drupal, there isn't much validation that happens. So he's doing a lot in that space where you can basically, go in and validate the configuration, and how that gets applied to recipes would make things safer and work better in the long run. So
you mentioned a lot about recipes being configuration. Do they have additional code like a module would, or are they only the configuration files that get applied?
Yes, so that is where I think the separation of church and state happens, where recipes do not have code. So they have a config file. I gave this talk at Design for Drupal and at DrupalCon, and everybody says, well, we need to run update hooks after we import the config, or we need to do this or that. So that's where recipes can be chained.
Okay.
So you could have this recipe require this recipe require that recipe, and then recipes can require modules and enable those modules also. So if you need to add code along the way, you can do that in a module that your recipe would require.
So I'm going to go off script for a second and ask, do you know if anybody in the initiative has talked to Jürgen Haas at ECA? Because I know that he has a configuration export, or like a feature export for helping him debug ECA models that does a fair, like, it will export a list of all the dependencies of modules, and it will export all the relevant configuration for the model, including content types and that kind of stuff. So it kind of handles some of that dependency gathering bit into an, and then he has an import function that will import all that into a site, so he can test a model. So I don't know if that's something that could be, possibly built on, or any issues that he ran into might be helpful for Alex and the team to think about too.
Sounds cool. Yeah, I don't know of any interaction with that gentleman or that module, but it is on the roadmap to have a recipe UI eventually, where you could help put together a recipe from configuration. Like, wouldn't that be a site builder's dream? I could build a blog and then export it to a recipe and share it with the world.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. So you mentioned profiles at the top of the show. Can you kind of tell us a little bit more about how they interact? Because I know, for example, like you said, if you start with the minimal profile and then you try to import some config from a site that has standard profile, it's just not going to work. It's going to be like, hey, these are different profiles, which personally I've never really understood, because it's like, if the module exists or that functionality exists, why can't you import it? You've already said that that's not the case with recipes, but can you just apply, like, once a recipe is applied and that's taken away, like there's no residual, there's nothing saying that something came from a recipe, right? So there's nothing preventing you from applying a different recipe, or applying the same recipe again or something, right? Like there's no hard law.
Correct. Awesome. There are feature requests, like a question I know John's going to ask about, can a recipe be unapplied? No, because at this point, we don't know that a recipe has been applied. But you could apply a recipe that could undo a recipe. But yeah, there are all these discussions. Should there be a record of recipes being applied somewhere so you could alter them later? Maybe. But all these things are still up for discussion.
So I'll double down. I'll double down on that question. And seeing as you already answered my next question, I'm wondering, like, a recipe literally is just a set of configs, set of modules, so on and so forth. Like, hey, here it is, right? Once that configuration, or that the config that recipe interacts with is changed, right? That recipe is done, so the recipe doesn't really care about it. The config is now in your site, and you can change it as you would, right?
Correct.
Okay, and then to get back to maybe that recipe's configuration, could you reapply the recipe? Would that overwrite the config that has already been applied or changed?
That is the hope. I don't know of
Okay.
anybody who has done a proof of concept of that, but sounds like a fun issue to create in the issue queue.
I mean, this is going to solve a huge problem for one of my clients, actually. So one of my clients has a number of sites, right? And most of the functionality is very different between the sites, but some of the configuration needs to be the same, like CSP site header rules and things like that. And it's fairly tedious and complex to keep all that configuration synced between 5 or 10 sites. But if we move that to a recipe, that just means if you need to add a new site header rule, you just add it to the recipe, reapply the recipe, and you're good to go. And that can even become part of the pipeline, right? Because if you just version the recipe and it's included always, you just have part of those pipeline just applies the recipe again, and that kind of stuff just will get updated whenever there's an update. That's going to be a huge that's going to solve a huge problem for that client.
I mean, that sounds like it solves that problem, but I feel like that also creates a lot of other problems if that was part of your pipeline, because then every time you're like, oh, I thought I fixed this view, like I wanted it to show 50 instead of 10 or whatever. And then every time you deploy, it's like, it's back again. It's the, like, because people who are maintaining the site, they aren't going to know what's in the recipe and what's not necessarily. And so that could also be a huge source of headaches.
That's very much a documentation of culture type thing. I mean, for this particular client, I mean, we have a few things like that we know are just like standard functionality that gets managed in this one place, right? And it's a small team, so it wouldn't be a huge problem, I think. And for agencies, I can really see things like, hey, meta tags are just managed this one way. They're in the recipe. And for people inheriting projects, yeah, that's going to be a major headache. But the efficiencies that you gain not having to reapply that kind of configuration 5 or 6 or 8 times, I think is worth the extra time you have to spend documenting something.
I also wonder what it's going to be like if you have a slideshow on your site and then you install a recipe for a slideshow later, if there's like a conflict in like the names of the views or the displays or something, you're going to overwrite if you import apply the recipe, you're going to overwrite that configuration, right? Is there some special convention that people use for recipes where the naming is done in a way that it's not going to conflict with anything that already exists, or
so I don't believe so. Since anybody can create a recipe, you could call it what you want. We'll go under the hood a little bit. At the core of recipes is an API called config actions. So config actions, there is a module in Contrib that was, I think, inspired by this. It's issue 3303127, where the config actions API were added into the project. So config actions allow us to do a few things. Update simple configuration. So you could take, not only can you apply a configuration that's in your recipe, but you can apply individual foobar statements inside of your config action. So that's in the recipe itself. You wouldn't even need to have a config file for something like node.settings, user.settings. So like we want to set our register to admin only, or system.theme. We want to set the admin theme to Gin and the default theme to Stark or Olivero or whatever we want. So you can update configuration that already exists inside of Drupal. And that's one thing we've never been able to do from the config folder in a module, right? You always needed an update hook or something to get in there and actually change existing config. And then you can hook into a config and then change things or add things to it. So like in a config action, you could grant permissions. So you're creating a content type using your config folder, but how do you add the permission to edit any event to the user role? So like that's another config action that you could do. So I think if a recipe could find the config that already exists, your view that lists 50 items, if it could find the view, and we could, I haven't messed with views with config actions yet. It's going to be fun to drill down into there. But yeah, we should be able to find that setting and reset it. So I think, Jen, what you're talking about is, yeah, you could really screw up somebody's site that they've customized, versus what Nick is talking about, where he's more maintaining a distribution that requires us to constantly update.
You can undo the problem somebody did.
Yeah.
So I think it's trying to be, the tool that we all could use. Like, yes, you could reapply the recipe later to make sure it's up, there and updated, or you could just let it be free out in the world.
So speaking of distributions, how do distributions of recipes differentiate? I mean, I gather it's that distributions provide a lot of functionality, whereas recipes provide configuration. Yeah.
So again, I think that distributions would be a tool. Recipes would be a tool in distributions toolbox. Instead of just your config install, config optional, and config override folder options, versus having to write a ton of update hooks to change things. They could use recipes as a piece of their distribution, a piece of their code base.
I mean, the major thing, and we've discussed this here though, right, is like distributions usually have code in them, right? So recipes solely configuration. I mean, I think the other big differentiator for me, and this is kind of what gets me so excited about recipes, is the fact that you're not hooked to them. You're not chained to them forever, right? So like with a distro, typically you are using that distro for forever, right? You're kind of like updating it as a whole module. So like to me, it feels nice to be able to say like, hey, here's a starting point for your site based on this set of code, and being able to kind of like run free, if you will, based on that starting point. As where like sometimes I think distros can get you into a spot where you're like you kind of feel trapped. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And another thing distributions can include now is content. Is there any talk about allowing a recipe to include content in the same way?
There is. It's one of the biggest pieces left in the phase 1 roadmap of recipes that hasn't been touched at all. So the issue is slim, but I believe it's the idea that there are config entities. So your configuration would be written into a YAML file, or your content would be written into a YAML file. That's probably going to be another foo bar. Here's your field name. Here's the content. There's a lot of thought about it, and like I think one of your listeners asked a question about content distribution leaning more towards like a workflow scenario where somebody could approve content. I don't think it's going to be that, but I'm thinking it's going to be more umami-like, where you could start with default content. You would have to, since it is content, right, you would have to reapply that recipe as you deploy to dev, test, and live, or your multi-dev or tugboat environments. So there are, I think, a lot of things to think about in that issue, or what will turn out to be many issues.
Is that accurate though? If you apply a recipe, right? I'm assuming that content gets added to the database, right?
Right.
So
And
that
Of
if
the
you're
environment
moving,
that you applied it to. It's not going
oh,
to get
right,
applied
correct. But like if you're just starting a site, then you're going to move that database from your local to dev to stage to prod, as you go. So experiences may vary, I guess, is what I'm saying there, right?
Sure,
But
sure.
that's super interesting. That was kind of one of my questions when Jen was asking about content, was like, you said you were trying to rebuild the the default Drupal install profile, right? And part of me was wondering if you guys were also working on like an umami install profile, and I imagine the content piece is a big part of that.
Well, once we get through the standard profile,
Right.
which I can say I personally have been working on it for a few months now in my free time, then I assume that the minimal profile will be relatively easy to do. And then there is also a ticket for the umami, which we really can't do until that default content ticket is solved.
Right.
And John, just remember, the point of recipes is that it's not just at the beginning of a site. It's not an install profile. It's not a distribution. You can imagine you have a privacy policy recipe, and that privacy policy includes privacy language as GDPR compliant. You would have to apply that at every single environment. You're not going to upload the database just to get that one piece of content. That would defeat the purpose.
Yeah. That's true. And like I said, like I think you have to apply it how you see fit. But it was just came to my attention that you may not necessarily have to apply it everywhere, which goes back to our beginning parts of this conversation with like how you go about applying a recipe is very important, because you may have to put that into a CI/CD process at some point in time. All right. We have quite a few listener questions in this show, which is awesome. So happy that our listeners chimed in via multiple methods, one being Slack, to ask questions. We actually have a question. Hold on, my computer just went to sleep. There we go. We have a question from James, and he's asking, so we've been talking very additively about recipes. Like recipes can add modules, and they can add content, and they can add configuration. His question is actually, can you use a recipe to uninstall modules? He has a couple of modules on every site that he builds. He just takes them right out of there, and he's wondering if he could use a recipe to do that for him. I'm assuming the answer is yes, but
I'm assuming the answer is I don't know. But I would like to take a little step back and say, why does he have to uninstall modules on every site that he starts? Is it because he's using a profile that installs modules for him? It might
probably. Yeah,
so,
there you go.
If he didn't have to use an install profile, well, what if Drupal came with only system enabled, and you could apply whatever recipe you wanted?
That would be
but
great.
It's a great question, and it actually started me to create issues in the Drupal initiatives recipe and distributions initiative issue queue with the header proof of concept. So it'd be great to see if we could uninstall a module. I know we could alter core.extension using a config action, and right. I don't know what it would do. Would it run all the uninstall hooks needed? But it's a great question.
From a recipe perspective, if I'm reading into this question a little bit, I do feel like from a recipe perspective, all a recipe should do is change that config to say, hey, this module is disabled, not uninstalled, but disabled, right? Because like when you uninstall a module, like typically it's a two-step process, right? You disable it from Drupal, then you uninstall it from your code base at some later date, depending on what your CI/CD process looks like. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe so hold on. There's one question just came to mind here. Is recipes working with, like other initiatives like the update initiative to, possibly use some of their composer interactions to do some of the things that recipes may or may not need to do? Is that something you guys are looking at?
I think it's on the roadmap.
Got it.
Discoverability of, since this is for ambitious site builders, is the primary audience. Integrating with project browser is on the roadmap sooner than automatic updates.
Sure.
But yes, I mean, it would be great if it could work with other core initiatives also.
I think too, the point is, if you can use recipes as kind of your starting place, that'd be great. Whether or not it can uninstall, uninstalling modules, I think would be helpful, maybe on some level. But the true problem that I run into is, I find you kind of have, if you're not using a distribution.
Nick, do you mean uninstall? Sorry, do you mean uninstall module or disable module? Because I think we're using that term interchangeably.
There isn't a difference in modern Drupal. It's the same. You can't have a module that's not uninstalled.
Well, I think the Drupal community still technically considers a module that's on the code base is installed, and uninstall means to delete it.
Sorry. I'm looking right now because I think Jed's right.
It deletes all of the data from the database already.
But not the actual files off the file system.
Yeah, so previous versions of Drupal had a state where you could turn it off and it didn't actually delete your data. And you could do that on your own if you wanted to or not. But now you can't have that. It only is there and not turned on yet. Or there and all your data is gone. That's the only way you can have.
So sorry, you were using the right terminology, Nick. That was on me. I was in my brain I was considering uninstalling, like removing from Composer.
John's still in Drupal 7.
I'm very much gotta update my lexicon here.
So
continue.
So anyway, back to my question. I think one of the it kind of sidesteps one of the problems when you're talking about starting with Drupal, because one of the things I found is with Drupal 8 and other versions of Drupal, if you're not using a distribution, you kind of really have to use the standard install profile. I'm not saying you can't use the other ones, but I've inherited sites that use the minimal profile and have run into problems. Basically, if I'm starting a site, I'm using the standard profile. That's it. The standard profile also comes with modules that I have, like Tor. I am never going to use the Tor module. You can just uninstall it. It's easy. Comments. Most of my, I think I've actually had a site that actually used comments that wasn't using like Discuss or something twice in 15 years. Like, it's very rare that I use that module. But you have modules like Shortcut, which some sites use. Some of my projects do. Most of my projects don't use Shortcut. But you can't just disable that module because it has content entities. You have to delete the default shortcuts before you can uninstall the module. And I imagine recipes aren't going to handle that issue. But the solution to the problem is being able to say, hey, my recipe just installs all these modules, not including those 3 or 4 that I never use, or like history, the history module. You almost never need that module. Like, there's just 8 or 10 modules.
Keep going, Nick.
Why they're in core.
Keep going.
But being able to instead go the other way and say, I'm starting a new site, install these 25 modules and be done with it would be a huge boon. It would save, half an hour of my time on every new project, which would be wonderful.
Nick, I feel like it sounds like after this show, you need to create yourself a recipe that you can just start installing things from.
I mean, when recipes are ready to start from, I'll be happy to do that.
So you could use recipes right now because they're ephemeral and they can be applied and not ship with your code base. There's no reason why you couldn't start experimenting with it now. And, by experimenting with it, you can hopefully find some bugs and create some issues and contribute some code back. I agree with you, but I do start all of my projects with the minimal profile. and then
Really?
I actually go in and import some configuration from standard that I need. There are some issues, like the workflow module assumes that there are states that were created in the standard recipe optional. So there are some assumptions in Drupal core even, and in a lot of contrib modules that you are starting from the standard profile.
That's why I never use minimal. You just run into
minimal always feels too minimal to me, which is I don't know. Maybe we should have a whole show on that topic.
Yeah. So what I did with in my approach to the replacing the standard profile as recipes was the idea of composability in those things. So like, what if I wanted the article content type, but I didn't want the tags taxonomy? So I tried to create, the article content type, the tags taxonomy, and then another recipe that would have it installed with both. So that's where trying to come up with a stack of, I do like some of the stuff in the standard profile, but definitely not all of it. Like you said, comments.
Jim, because of the structure of these, right? These are, recipes are, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the recipes are like, just basically YAML files, right? Somebody could take once this is released into core, right? And somebody could take that core recipe install profile for core, right? And change it to be more of what they're looking for, right?
Correct.
So there you go, Nick. You have to wait. Once they have a full install profile, then you can take it and do whatever you want with it.
So the idea of replacing the install profile as a recipe or a suite of recipes is a proof of concept. I don't know if that's going to be applied to Drupal core. It hasn't been discussed with the Drupal core team. There's an extension of that is other core modules have a config folder. Should all core modules have their config folders replaced with recipes? There's an issue for it. I don't think anybody will get to it anytime soon. But there is that idea. If it can be a core-wide tool, or we're just doing this as a proof of concept to see if we can, and install profiles will always remain in Drupal.
Yeah. So speaking of recipes in core and issues, when will this feature be in core? When do you think, what's the timeline looking like? Are you thinking 10.2, 11.1, 11.0?
I would not care to wager on that. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Like I mentioned earlier, it seems like all Drupal initiatives that I've seen as of late are the brainchild of a super smart developer or a couple super smart developers. Some like single directory components, like Matteo whipped that out in no time. He had experience getting JSON API into core, and within 6 months it seems like he got single directory components into core because he knew
it was fast
everything what to do. Other initiatives like the JavaScript modernization, or there was somebody trying to make the Drupal logs JavaScript. I don't think that had much effort behind it. It might still be going on. It might not be. So not all initiatives land in core. They are great experiments, and hopefully it'll end up in core sooner than later.
Once it is in core, has there been any talk about using it for the testing framework? We have a lot of tests that test whether Drupal is working, whether correctly or not, and those often include some default configuration to test something like, does this content type have this field or what have you? Is there any thought of replacing that with recipes, and would that make the testing system run faster?
This is the first I'm hearing of this brilliant idea.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, we could make an issue for it.
Cool.
So we're going to start with we've had a couple questions from Slack already, but we now have a long list of them. So let's start with Andy's question. Can recipes and starter kit interact? For example, could recipes include making a new theme or use a contrib theme as a starter kit template without adding the contrib theme to the project's dependencies? And for our listeners, starter kit is kind of like the new way to create a fresh theme from scratch. And it makes a lot of things easier. So will recipes interact with them?
So I had heard of starter kit before. I had to, when Andy asked this question, I had to look up how it works. So with Drupal core, you already have the themes in your project. So you could just have a script that runs and clones it. But Andy wants to clone a theme that's in the contrib space. So I would need to run a recipe that would get that contributed theme. Then I would need to somehow run the starter kit script. And I believe the starter kit script uses that Drupal core script. So how would we run that? Maybe a script in the script section of your composer.json, or another module that would be required to run that script.
Yeah.
And then I would need another recipe to uninstall or the contrib theme and remove the module if we needed to have a module. So it is possible in my brain. I also created a proof of concept issue in the Drupal recipes and distributions initiative issue queue to see if that's possible.
So if a recipe includes a bunch of default configurations, can a theme require a recipe, or does it have to go the other way around where the recipe has to require the theme? Seems like that could be really useful if it went both ways, but that's possible.
Well, at this point, Drupal recipes doesn't have a home on Drupal.org yet. So I think you would, like a theme or a module needs to require a contrib module that's on Drupal.org, right? From coming from the packages or whatever. So at this point, I don't think so, but again, cool proof of concept there. Yeah.
And they're ephemeral, so there's no way to determine if they've been run or not already, right? Is that?
Yeah. I mean, it would happen on theme installation. I would imagine that you could get a recipe that
you could check for it.
But I believe the flip side that a recipe could require a theme.
Great.
Another question coming in from Matthew on Slack. How do Drupal recipes articulate versus Symfony recipes, and are they even related?
They are not directly code related. Symfony recipes are applied to Symfony, and Drupal recipes are applied to Drupal. So the structure is different, and what they need to do is different, but the idea is the same, that you have a pre-configured bunch of functionality that you can apply. There was even, never mind Symfony recipes. My good friend Bob Snodgrass from the suburbs of Chicago had a group in Fox Valley that had a project called Drupal Recipes, and they were building, like you'd think in a cookbook, recipes on how to configure this and how to configure that. They were doing it all manually, but really helping out site builders, building out steps to build a piece of functionality. So this idea has been around for a number of years, and Alex Pott, whipped up a bunch of code that magically made it happen, and it needed a great name. That was Recipes came to be.
We have another question from Slack. James asks, how easy will it be to create my own custom recipes? James has a set of modules he installs on every new site, and so he's looking forward to using a recipe for that instead.
James can do that today. I wouldn't pretend that it's easy. It's a little ableistic speak, but it is a YAML file. We're getting better with our documentation on how to do this. There's a few great blog posts, and as I find examples in the community, I post them in the Distributions and Initiative Slack channel. We have a meeting every 2 weeks that I point out some folks are out there sharing their recipes. So, there's nothing like copying and pasting somebody else's great work and tweaking it to make it do what you want to do.
Sure. And Matthew has another question. Is there anything that contrib maintainers should be doing to prepare for recipes or monitoring to update, like Martin was talking about with his earlier this morning?
Yeah, I don't think anything at this time. We be aware of the initiative and the possibilities that the tool could do to help people. The Quickling kit was a perfect example. I maintain a few modules that are basically configuration only. So those kind of contrib maintainers it's a great opportunity for those modules to be replaced with recipes to make things a little easier to maintain in the long run for the end user of the site or the end developer of the site.
If people are really excited about recipes, how can they get involved or contribute?
Why, I believe I mentioned it, but there is a project on Drupal.org. It is called, I probably murdered the name a bunch of times, the Distributions and Recipes Initiative. So I've seen this before in a couple other initiatives like Olivero and single directory components. The work of the initiative is done in a fork of Drupal. So the project can iterate faster and make as many commits as they want without having to patch it every single time. So the project is a fork of Drupal 10.1, I think, at this point. There is a patch that gets created using the Drupal CI. So all you have to do is apply a patch to your Drupal 10 and higher, and then you have the recipe runners and everything you need to apply the recipe. So in the code base, there is a plethora of documentation in this project, and there is an issue queue where we create issues and feature requests and support requests. There is a Slack channel called Distributions and Recipes in the Drupal Slack, and there is a meeting that happens every 2 weeks. There is an issue in somewhere in Drupal it's under the infrastructure project. If you search for Drupal issue 3269687, and I'll add that to the project notes, there is a meeting thread where you can add your Slack name to the ping list. So every time we start a meeting, you can get pinged if you want to. We don't at here or at channel everybody. We just ping the people that want to be pinged. So that's always fun.
Jim, you might have mentioned this and maybe I missed it, but is the meeting in person via Zoom or is it via a Slack meeting, or how is that run?
It is an asynchronous Slack meeting. So it is not in person at this time. It is typed. We collect the issues and then save them to Drupal.org at a later date.
I think we missed one really important question too. I'm just realizing, and that is, how do you create a recipe?
How do you create a recipe? So there is an amazing blog post by our friend Kevin Quillen. Blog post is on valier.com, and it's called Exploring the New Drupal Recipes feature. So we plan to turn this into our foundation for our documentation, but this is a step-by-step on how he created his recipes and applied it to a project. And it's a really cool recipe. Again, coming from an agency point of view, this is a starter template for their agency's Drupal projects. And he estimated that it saves his agency 2 to 4 hours on every new project.
Oh, wow. Impressive. Well, Jim, thank you for joining us again. It was a pleasure having you on to talk about recipes. I'm really excited about this.
Great. Yeah, and love to answer all your listeners' questions in Slack. So keep them coming.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on X with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. Okay, so Jim, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, say hi if you're on Cape Cod. Go out for some Chipino. Ping me in the Drupal Slack is probably the best way, or join the distributions and recipes channel and say hi there.
Awesome. Jen, how about you?
You can also find me on Drupal Slack, but more often I am on the free open source alternative Zulip. So if you want to find me on Zulip chat.
John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out more about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at NixVan, NICXVAN.
And as always, if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.